learn more on the economic impact of the Russian sanctions, let's bring in John Quelch. He's the Dean of the University of Miami, Herbert Business School. Good to have you with us, sir. You heard all of that, and I'm sure we all have our own opinions. What do you think the next move is for President Putin here?
Just as the Ukrainian resistance was stronger than expected, so the economic damage to Russia from the Western sanctions has been significant, but not crippling. And interestingly, the Russian economy has been pivoting, perhaps not as quickly as one would imagine, but the ruble has strengthened against the dollar. Russia is still able to find markets for many of its exports and is engaged in import substitution. We have to remember that only around 45 countries are in the group that are enforcing sanctions on Russia, and in many cases those countries have been deliberately slow to enforce sanctions because they are, of course, dependent heavily on Russian energy supplies. So the Russian economy is actually holding up better than expected, and in fact the forecasts for contraction in the Russian economy have narrowed significantly over the last couple of months, as it's become clear that the rise in commodity prices is enabling the Russian economy to actually stay ahead of the expenditures that it's putting out in the Ukraine war.
Right.
So while things are bad for Russia and for Russian people, Russia has not been driven to capitulation at this point.
So, I mean, that's a nice way of saying that the sanctions are not having their intended impacts. I mean, obviously there is an impact, but it's now been over 100 days, and there are still countries that continue to do business with Russia. Clearly, the West would disagree with that, but at this point, this is where we are, right? So the future of sanctions, I assume they're likely to continue, but at some point, there has to be a different strategy.
Around about 50% of Russian imports and exports are with countries that are within the sanctions regime. But that leaves a tremendous number of countries for Russia to find substitute markets for their products and from which to find substitute imports. But what was interesting today was that the speech by President Putin really placed a lot of emphasis on national self-sufficiency and national resilience, and clearly there's a determination to reduce the dependency of Russia on international trade. They have perhaps taken a bigger hit than they expected from the dependency that they've built up over the last 20 years.
You know, it's been talked about quite a bit that India has been one of the buyers of Russian oil. And everyone's been kind of quiet about this. What's going on?
The relationship between India and China is one that's evolved over the last decade. And it's interesting because in the Soviet era, the Soviet government typically aligned with Pakistan, I beg your pardon, typically aligned with India, and the Chinese government with Pakistan. So there has been a shift in that regard. I think that, you know, India is flexing its muscle on the international stage, and we saw that in the last 48 hours at the World Trade Organization meeting where the Indian delegation held out until the end for protections for its fisheries industry. So India is not wanting to be left out of the equation when it comes to world power broking, and aligning with Russia conveniently in terms of taking energy from Russia makes a lot of sense for India.
What would your advice be to Western leaders as they continue to watch this develop, and everybody on both sides I know of would like to have some peace, or at minimum a ceasefire, but we just aren't getting it yet. What would your advice be?
I think number one, Russia is not going to go away. Number two, there is no point in perpetuating a stalemate situation that ends up with the destruction of Ukraine and at the same time leaves President Putin in power. So whether it's through back channels that might involve India, that might involve Egypt, could be Turkey, could be Israel. There are a number of countries which have very good relationships with both West and East. And frankly, I think it's time on behalf of the Ukrainian people for there to be a really important dialogue around solving the problem. You know, some people say it's in the interests strategically of the West to continue this stalemate where Ukraine is given just enough weaponry to stay in the game and to keep Russia occupied and pinned down. But that is with the result of further death and destruction to Ukrainian people and to the country that they're fighting for. So at some point, common sense has to prevail in the interests of preventing further death and destruction.
John, thank you for your analysis on highlighting some of the problems. I hope next time we talk, we are talking about some of the solutions and perhaps a more positive outcome. Have a good weekend. Thank you very much, Dean at the University of Miami's Business School.